So I was born in Chico, California, which is about 80 miles north of Sacramento, so it's way up there, and it was actually a very small community.
So that's north. That's like in the northern part.
Oh yeah,
of it.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, like almost southern Oregon. But the community was very much like Culpeper. It was a smaller town, rural, very agrarian, and I loved it. But growing up, my father was actually a police officer. My mother was a nurse, and I actually ended up spending a lot of time with my grandparents. And my grandfather on my mother's side was Air Force Reserve, and then my grandfather on my father's side was a World War II veteran who was in the Navy.
So did they fill you with stories?
They did.
They shared stories.
Yes, especially that was always my grandfather on my dad's side was a gun collector, and one of the most fun memories for me was going into my Papa Bill's den, and Grandma Pup, as we called her, would bring cookies, and I'd go and sit in the den with Grandpa, and he'd smoke his pipe and tell stories. And it was incredible. Yeah.
So you grew up with that. You grew up with that background. Now, did you have siblings that were also interested in military, or is this?
I did. So I'm actually the oldest of 9 children. So there was me and my brother from when my dad and mom were married, and then my dad and my stepmother had 7 more children. I served in the military, obviously, and then my next youngest brother also served in the military as well. He served for 3 years. Okay,
so tell me, at what age or so did you decide, and did you enlist?
I did.
Okay, and which branch? Well, I know, but...
You mean there's other branches?
Yeah, I know! I mean, what was your decision? Because to go into the Army?
Well, interestingly enough, it was one of the same things that attracted me to Culpeper from an early age, because I actually visited this area when I was 13 to tour Civil War battlefields. So I was always very interested in military history, and especially Civil War history, and so just fascinated with the tactics, the different commanders, the different just stories related to it. And then my family had a long history of service, both in the military, law enforcement, nursing. And so there was a lot of encouragement there as well. But I think probably junior high and high school is when it became evident to me that I was going to serve in the military. Originally, a good friend of mine and I, we both wanted to go to West Point, because we, again, studied a lot about the Civil War, and the Civil War commanders are essentially a who's who of West Point graduates in a lot of ways. And it was interesting. We both applied, and when he did his interview, they were very impressed. And when I did my interview, they looked at my math scores and said, "Have you considered doing something else?" So I ended up enlisting as opposed to going to West Point, and I think it was a great decision for me. I really enjoyed being an enlisted man and an NCO, and I still enjoy giving all the officers in the General Assembly and my larger acquaintance a lot of trouble for not being NCOs. But yeah, so I think from an early age, I knew I was going to join the military. I knew I was going to join the Army, and I knew I wanted infantry.
Okay, so this is where we're leading up to. Where did you do your basic training then?
Fort Benning, Georgia.
Oh!
So, yeah, so I...
so that's a ways from California.
It is, and it was interesting. When I first walked into the recruiter's office, it was a peacetime Army at that point. There wasn't a lot going on in the way of major conflicts.
I'm going to stop you 1 second,
Sure.
just so I can get a sense of timing now, because you're California. So you were what, 18 or 19 when
I was 17 when I joined the California National Guard, and then 18 when I enlisted in the military.
Okay, so we're now around 1998.
98.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
in 1990, I walked into the recruiter's office and I said, "All right, look, here's the deal. I've got pretty good grades, because even though I couldn't they weren't West Point worthy, but they were still pretty good grades. I've never been in trouble. And I want to enlist in the Army, but if you can't give me infantry, I'm not interested." And of course, he was like, "Well, we'll see what we can do." But so I ended up getting infantry and an airborne contract, and shipped off to Fort Benning in the summer of 1998. So about 2 weeks after graduating high school, and I always tease people who are from Georgia, because I always say, well, look, I'm not trying to judge all of Georgia by Fort Benning, but every time I've gone to Georgia, which between basic and airborne and sniper and ranger, I said, it's always been hot, I've always been hungry, and people have always been yelling at me. So I don't have good memories of Georgia necessarily. But yeah, so went to, summer of 98 is when I went through basic training and AIT. Fort Benning.
Okay, so how long were you there? What was that like? What was that training like? You mentioned airborne and some of these others.
Well, I think the hardest part of basic training in general was very family oriented, And at the time, Tina, who's now my wife,
I was going to ask you because I know
yeah,
that you married shortly after high school.
we did. Yeah, I got married at 19,
Mm-hmm.
and I really tried to play it cool before I left for basic training, and but oh gosh, within about 4 days of getting down there, I was just forlorn that I was going to be away from Tina for several months, and she wrote me almost every day while I was in basic. But it, again, it was a very interesting experience. It was a great experience. I think one of the things that was kind of funny was my drill sergeant there, Drill Sergeant Quashi, who I believe was originally from Jamaica, but he was kind of that scary drill sergeant that everyone talks about. Yeah, that everyone's, the big guy that booming voice and just intimidating, but somebody he had a tremendous amount of respect for. And I think one of the funniest things was all through basic, whenever you go through the chow hall, I mean, if you even glanced over at the cake, Drill Sergeant Quashi had some sort of indicator in his mind that you were doing this and you were in trouble. It turns out I left basic, and that I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years later, I was going to Ranger School, and Drill Sergeant Quashi and I were both going to Ranger School together as students. And we saw each other from across the room during orientation. He looked at me and he just rolled his eyes.
Like, oh no.
And I said, Drill Sergeant. He looked at me and goes, don't call me that here. Because if the cadre had found out he was a drill sergeant. And then, but anyways, it was just a funny story. And by the time we got to Florida phase of Ranger School, we had to do KP duty in between our other duties. And Drill Sergeant Quashi was the one manning the cake portion. And so I got to walk up to my drill sergeant and making an extra big piece, Drill Sergeant.
All right, so you're doing basic and you're doing this other. So at some point, did you deploy? Did you sign up for deployment? How did that happen?
Sure. Well, so again, this time I graduated basic in 98.
98.
And then went to the 82nd Airborne Division. So I served with the 2nd.
Now, is that still in Georgia or is that?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is in Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Okay.
So served with the 2nd Battalion, 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment, which actually takes its heritage from the glider regiments during World War II.
Oh,
And,
so it all kind of cycles back. I mean, I'm just thinking of your grandparents.
Yeah. So, and one of the greatest things about being in the 82nd Airborne Division is there's a lot of history there, and then every year they do All-American Week, where all of the veterans come back from the 82nd, and there's a lot of ceremonies and there's a lot of events where the current soldiers from 82nd get to speak to the soldiers and the veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And you think you're a tough guy until you walk in and you're talking to somebody with those airborne rings, and they've got 4 gold stars representing 4 combat jumps. And one of the things that they used to like to do is say, how many jumps do you have? Oh, I have 50 jumps. I have 60 jumps. How many do you, sir? And I have 7, 5 of them combat. So it was a very humbling experience, but it was a great time. But that was my first duty station, was Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with 2nd and 325.
So no fear of heights?
I affectionately called Airborne School the Gravity Applies to You School.
Yep.
And the first time jumping out, one of the things about the military is you're always managing fears. So there's the fear of gravity, but there's also the fear of being mocked by your comrades. And you find that the fear of being mocked by your comrades is significantly higher than the fear of gravity or being shot at, or a number of other things. But no, it was a good experience. I actually almost got out of the military after being in the 82nd for 3 years, and one of the reasons I did was when I was coming up for my first reenlistment, and the 82nd had been very good to me. I had gotten to go to air assault school, EMT school, Ranger school.
So you're still stateside doing all
I'm
this?
still stateside. Ranger school, sniper school. I'd gotten to go to a lot of different schools within the 82nd, and by this time I was a scout team leader in the scout platoon within the battalion. And the only thing going on at that time was Kosovo. And our sister battalion, 1st of the 325, was going to go over to Kosovo. And so I wanted to re-enlist, and usually when you re-enlist that first time you have a lot of options. They want to keep you in the military. So I wanted to re-enlist to cross the street to go over to the other battalion because they were the ones going to Kosovo. And my commander and sergeant major were not too happy about this because it comes out of their battalion's budget to send you to all of these schools. And so they'd sent me to all these schools, and they thought it wasn't very nice of me.
No, they want you to stay with them.
They wanted to, but I really wanted to. I wanted to deploy, and so they didn't let me. And I had actually considered getting out and joining the LAPD like my father was.
Mm-hmm.
And Tina said, "Well, look, Nick, we haven't really planned to get out of the military. Why don't we just pick some place that we really want to go to, and we'll do that?" And I said, "All right, do you want to go to Hawaii or Italy?" She said Hawaii, and so we got to Hawaii, and 3 months later, September 11th happened. And at that point, so I was serving in 2nd Battalion, 27th Regiment, which was the Wolfhounds. And
where are you rank-wise in all of this?
At this point, I'm still an E4, so I'm a specialist. So I get over to Hawaii, and 3 months later, 9/11 happens, and I told Tina, I said, well, now I know what I'm doing for the next several years. And I remember telling her, I said, if we don't deploy within 6 months, I'm going to volunteer for Special Forces. And 6 month mark kind of came and went, and I was watching things transpire in Afghanistan and things leading up to Iraq from Hawaii, and so I volunteered to go to Special Forces selection, which was back at Fort Bragg. Made it through selection, and then by the time I deployed to go back to, or excuse me, not deployed, but went back to Fort Bragg to go through the Special Forces qualification course, I had been promoted to sergeant and then staff sergeant, and so showed up, reported back to Fort Bragg.
Your favorite place?
Showed up back to Fort Bragg to go through the Special Forces qualification course, which was, you had numerous phases. It's changed a lot since I went through, but initially you went in and you had to go through some leadership training. They had a basic non-commissioned officers course for those of us that hadn't been through that yet, and then you went through small unit tactics training, which was kind of like a smaller version of Ranger School. So I got to do that twice, and then between Ranger and that, and then went through the 18 Bravo course, which was a Special Forces weapons sergeant, and then after that you went back to Camp McCall, where you did your Robin Sage course. And Robin Sage is actually the single largest unconventional warfare training exercise in the United States. And pretty much the entire state of North Carolina is in play. And what's interesting is that it's been going on since the I want to say it's been since the early 60s. And so there's communities where there's been generations that have, civilians that have participated in this exercise. So they turned North Carolina into Pineland. And you're working with an insurgent force to overthrow the government. And if you're driving in a car and you turn on the radio station, you'll hear Radio Pineland in certain areas of North Carolina.
That's interesting.
And the local police are involved, the local hospitals are involved, and it really is a very elaborate exercise in order to prepare Green Berets to engage in unconventional warfare.
Well, you see a lot, I've seen things on television and you hear about these things with Special Forces, but what's the most grueling thing they have you do? I mean, you hear these things where they keep you up and then you have to find your way and all this.
I guess it's kind of difficult to come up with what was the most difficult from a training perspective. Ranger school was very difficult. I went into, I think I lost about 25 to 30 pounds in 70 days in Ranger school. I went in a fairly lean 155 and came out an emaciated 128.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And it was a lot of the sleep deprivation and food deprivation was at the same time that you're operating, and you're to get about 30 to 45 minutes of sleep over a 3-day period is not 2 to 3 day period is not abnormal in Ranger school. And then within the Special Forces qualification course, you go through similar food and sleep deprivation during small unit tactics and Robin Sage. SEER school was probably one of the more psychologically trying ones, and that's the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape school. And you sign a non-disclosure agreement when you go to SEER, so you can't really speak to it. But needless to say, that's where they go to train you how to, essentially, the motto is to return with honor, should you ever find yourself as a prisoner of war. And one of those moving aspects of that was going through some of the psychological components, but then when you graduated, one of the ceremonies that you went through post-graduation was POWs came and visited and shared their experiences and signed your diploma from SEER school. So it was, most people have been through to say the same thing. Excellent school, would never want to go back.
I was going to say, and I know not with specific numbers, but the graduation rate. I mean, did guys make it through that? Not? Or?
Yeah. No, they did. It's not so much a pass-fail course. I mean, you can fail it or you can quit. When I went through, it was all people going through special forces. It was all people going through to become Green Berets, and nobody. And it was the very last thing you did, so nobody was going to quit during that. So that wasn't so much the issue, unless you got hurt. But no, for the most part, it was just. Again, we learned a lot, but you went through a lot of psychological aspects going through the course. But as soon as you graduate that, you get your Special Forces tab, and then you find out which Special Forces group you're going to be assigned to. And I was assigned to 3rd Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group in Fort Lewis, Washington.
Okay.
And then from there,
so how long were you there?
5 years.
5 years. Okay.
5 years with ODA. It was Operational Detachment Alpha, or kind of commonly known as a Special Forces A team. So our numbers changed because we added a 4th battalion to the different groups. It used to be only 3 battalions. But so 2006 was the first time I deployed over to Iraq, and we were in the part of Special Operations Task Force North, and so that was my first deployment. And again, it was a very interesting experience. One of the things I love about Special Forces, and I used to tell new guys as they would come in, I said, we're not John Rambo, we're Lawrence of Arabia, because everything we did was by, through, and with the local population, and that in itself was an amazing experience.
So what types of things were you doing over there?
So the primary focus in Iraq at that point was counterinsurgency. So we were working with and training the Iraqi military. Some units were training the Iraqi police forces. And then we would go out on combined missions with our Iraqi counterparts in order to identify and then capture terrorists and take down terrorist cell networks within Iraq. And so an average day in Iraq might be something where, depending on what your duty position was on the team, when I was in 18 Bravo, primarily I'd be over with the Iraqi scout platoon, and we would be training them in basic infantry and reconnaissance tactics, close quarters battle, at the same time that our intel people would be working on what our next target was, and then we would, when it came time, when we had enough information in order to go and execute a target, I'd gather up my Iraqi scouts, and we would go through the planning phases, and then we'd get into our Humvees and roll out to the objective and do what we did.
So, and did you witness, I mean, I'm sure there were casualties that happened, or?
I have to say, especially some of the veterans that served in World War II or in Vietnam, or just even some of my counterparts that served in different areas, a lot of it depended. If you were in Anbar Province in 2006, it was a far more dangerous place than where I was in 2006 in Saladin Province. But there was one moment in particular in 2008, and it was a good experience because we had 25 Shia Iraqi soldiers led by a major that I was advising, 6 Green Berets, and then 25 Sunni militiamen. So we were going out on an operation together, and the purpose was we were looking for some weapons caches, and we were also looking for the lieutenant of a known terrorist leader who would really popularize suicide bombing. Suicide bombing had not been that common among the fight in Iraq until you had a much more of an influence through Al-Qaeda. And this particular terrorist leader, he was number 6 on the target list for Iraq, and we were constantly fighting with his cell and his operations within this area. So we went out to the JSS, which was the Joint Security Site, so it was a combination site of American troops and our Iraqi police and military. And we sat around a coffee table, and the Iraqis talked about which objectives that they wanted to hit, and pulled out a small piece of paper and started to write out some of the plan, because we had one idea of what we were doing before we went out there, and then things changed. And it was actually very encouraging, because the Shia commander said, we want to work with the local militia here, which were all Sunni. And so again, that was encouraging that they wanted to build that kind of unity and cohesiveness between the regular army and the Sunni militia. So we get into our Humvees, and a small sedan pulls up, and I think they fit 7 or 8 people in this sedan. So you had legs and arms with machine guns sticking out the windows, and it looked a little Keystone Cops. But we drove to our first objective, didn't find anything. Drove to our second objective and found the lieutenant that we were looking for. And when I say lieutenant, I'm not talking about an actual rank, but a subordinate for this terrorist cell leader. And thought we were done for the day. And the Iraqi commander comes over and goes, "We want to go to one more place." And we knew exactly where we wanted to go. There had been, I think, somewhere around over 30 separate operations launched to try to get this particular individual. And so we said, okay, let's do it. So my guys went outside. The militia and the Iraqis moved forward to clear the objective. And what's important to understand about where we were in Iraq at this point is obviously a lot of desert in Iraq.
I was going to ask you about the terrain. We mostly see pictures of very flat desert.
Yeah, and that's very accurate.
And some mountains, but sometimes depends.
Very accurate for where we were at. If you get into the north, it gets more mountainous. But when you get right next to the Tigris, all of a sudden there's a lot of foliage, and it can actually be pretty thick. So I walk in with the Iraqi major in order to talk to the people who own the house and the property, who we know had worked with this terrorist leader. And no sooner had I taken my helmet off, and the Iraqi major starts to talk with the homeowner, that explosion goes off, and then machine gun fire. And so I grabbed my helmet and ran outside, and we're trying to assess the situation. But in this case, it's very thick. And one of the things that was, I always say, had there been a recruiter right there, I would have enlisted for the rest of my life. Because as I looked around, and it wasn't because of the danger, I'm not being cavalier, it was more because without any orders or any direction, all of the guys that I had served with, and these aren't just people in my unit, these are really close friends of mine, everyone is just doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And it was that process of kind of bringing order to chaos. And 2 of our Iraqis have been hit with a grenade shrapnel. There was a lot of machine gun fire going off, and so we were trying to get everyone online, pointing in the right direction, and making sure that they weren't shooting unless they knew what they were shooting at. We obviously didn't want anybody to get hurt, one of our guys or a civilian. And so once we had kind of calmed down and had some time to assess the situation, we pulled our 2 Iraqis that had been wounded out, and started to clear the building, set up our perimeter, make sure that whoever had done this hadn't got out. But at this point, we still didn't know what was going on, or there was some speculation that they had tripped a booby trap. In fact, this is kind of the interesting fog of war. We had a couple guys saying it was a booby trap. We had other guys saying, no, I saw someone. And so we weren't really sure what we had. So we're calling Apache gunships, and they're going up and down the Tigris, monitoring to make sure that no one is trying to escape across the river. And I was walking back with one of my interpreters, and who was an Iraqi, and then and one of the Sunni militiamen, and we see this padded down grass. Essentially, you can tell there was a foot trail going into the thick of it. And so I walked over to my good buddy Riley, and I said, all right, Riley, we're going to go forward of the line. Please make sure that all the Iraqis know we're forward of the line. And we're only talking about maybe 30 yards from the line to the river. I said, tell everyone, don't shoot under any circumstances. We've got troops forward of the line. And so Riley made sure that information was dispersed, and then myself and my interpreter and a couple of the militiamen, we started to follow this little trail into the thick grass. And there was one, as we walked forward, there was this one drop-off point, and you could tell where there was a bunch of like underground tunnels. You could tell the entry point to them. And not a lot you can do with that, so we pulled out a flashbang and threw it down there and kind of jumped in after it as fast as I could, and flashed around with my flashlight and didn't see anything. And at this point, I'm furious, because I think I'm
scared.
Well,
I have this image of, why go on that trail?
Yeah. Well, I was really mad, because I'm thinking at this point, this guy got away. how could he get away? We got our perimeter in, we did the right things, and it was just frustrating. So I come up out of this hole, and then we walk a little bit farther down the trail, maybe just 2 or 3 feet, and we look down, and there's another trail down leading to another area. And at this point, we can see that someone had like a poncho set up, and you can see blankets on the ground just at the mouth of kind of this little hiding spot. And I look over at my interpreter, and I'm like, tell him to come out. And he yells, and we kind of shoot down at the base of this hiding area to try to convince this guy that it's time to call it quits. and there's no response, and so I take off my M4 and I hand it to him because there's not a lot of room to move with this. So I hand it to him, and I take out my pistol and I take out my flashbang, and I throw the flashbang down, and then I jump in right after as fast as I can. And sure enough, it's definitely an area where someone has been bedding down for the night or hiding. There's a lot of blankets. There's different bags. There's a rifle. And I'm trying to keep my balance. So I've got my pistol up. But I'm crouched down low. And I go to catch my balance, and I hit something, and all of a sudden a string goes, and then a grenade falls like that on a table. So I let go of the I let go of the thing that I grabbed, and I radio up to Riley, because again at this point I'm thinking maybe it was a booby trap that got these guys. And I tell Riley, I'm like, hey, just tell everyone to be careful. I think I might have tripped something. And at this point I'm just mad again because I don't see anybody, and I'm sure this guy has gotten away. And right as I'm about to crawl up out of this hole again, I see 2 feet peeking out from underneath the blanket. And again, call out to him, and no response. So made sure the area was safe. Explosive ordnance disposal comes out and clears everything. There's no booby traps, so that was positive. and then we go back into the hole, and the guy had been killed. Roll him over, and it was the number 6 target in Iraq. And it was an amazing experience, because as we pulled him out, and the Iraqis, especially the militia members who lived in this area, who had just been terrorized by this guy, the first glimpse they caught of his face and saw who it was just Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. By the time we had finished searching the area and doing everything else that was necessary, and drove him back into the town for confirmation, the streets had just been, people just poured into the streets. Because he had specifically targeted orphan children and women with mental handicap issues, because in certain parts of Iraq they were easy targets. They were easy targets for exploitation. And so he would have children ride their bicycles into a crowded marketplace, and if they didn't self-detonate, one of his guys would remote detonate kids in a crowded marketplace. So this, when we got him, and especially the way it happened with the Iraqi army, the local militia group, small footprint of Americans doing what Green Berets are supposed to be doing.
So it was a coordinated, or
it was very
collaborative.
It was
effort.
Yes, it was very very collaborated, or very collaborative, and it was kind of a turning point in that particular area, because it wasn't seen as the Americans just coming in and doing something. It was seen as them taking back their own community and getting this guy that had just terrorized them. And so it was very great. And thankfully, our 2 Iraqis that have been hurt, they recovered fully. And there was actually the government of Iraq and I think the U.S. government have both put a reward on this particular terrorist. And so the 2 Iraqis that have been wounded, they were able to split the reward between them, which was a huge benefit for their families. And but yeah, as far as dealing with casualties, again, I should say I'm very lucky that our team did not have any casualties on that deployment.
I have a question. When you talk about your interpreter and the Sunnis and the different groups, I'm always one for, it's always easier for me in situations to have clarity. How clear were those lines? I mean, was there I mean,
As far as,
you could trust your interpreter
oh,
that they were interpreting correctly,
yeah.
and that when you went into these places, I mean, was it clear all the time just who the enemy was or not? Or you can,
No.
because, you know, you see images
Yeah.
of these villages that they go into, and quite frankly, everybody looks pretty much the same. You know, who's
No.
friendly and who's not. I wouldn't, you know.
Yeah, no, there really isn't. You're not. I mean, you have a good idea. You know who, you usually know who the major players are. But the problem with a counterinsurgency environment, the way that Al Qaeda operated, was that somebody putting an IED on the side of the road, more often than not, was not they were not radicalized. They were dealing with a situation where an Al Qaeda terrorist cell might come in and say, here are your options. I can pay you $200 to put in a bomb, which is a month's worth of pay, or I can kill your family. Well, what are these guys going to do? So a lot of the IED emplacers, which were just the people, again, they put the bomb in the road, and you either self-detonated when you rolled over it, or they went offside and they detonated it. That was not really the people that we were after. We wanted the cell leaders. We wanted the people that were truly radicalized, that were trying to fight us. And so there was the friend and foe component, but then there was also the people that weren't foes as much as they were people put in a kind of an untenable situation. And some of the things that we did finally do in Iraq, like the Sons of Iraq program, where we did allow these local militias to stand up and start taking responsibility for their own communities, that was instrumental. You could have shipped all the American troops over there you wanted, in my opinion, but without empowering the localities to be able to defend their own communities, I don't think you would have seen the success that you started to in 2008 and 2009. So yeah, that part was difficult.
Challenging.
But that's a component of counterinsurgency. As for our interpreters, all three of the interpreters that we had in 2008 are now in the United States. And it's because all three of them had threats to their family. Whenever we went on an objective, they had to wear masks because you didn't know who the enemy was. And you might have people within your own organization that were actually reporting to Al Qaeda or different Shia terrorist groups. So they had to wear masks. But they did an outstanding job. And I will say that the interpreters that we had went above and beyond what was required of them. They could have very easily sat back and said, well, my job is to just interpret, but they got into the thick of it with us. They really felt like members of the unit, and I know we all felt the loyalty to them, and so when it was time to help advocate for them to be able to move them and their families to the United States in order to be safe, that was something we were all too happy to do. And I'm Facebook friends with all of them.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you too. If
Yeah.
you've kept up communications with some of these fellows that you were with, and
I have. That's why when it's interesting with
and they're probably all over the country. Or?
They are. But when certain issues come up, especially when we talk about refugees and things like that, and you know, whereas I even want more security for that on the legislative side, I still remind people that, hey, some of these people coming over have a passion for the United States because they really do care about us. And again, those three guys, I can't say enough good things about them. They were willing. I would say they're everybody was willing to get to step in front of a bullet for their country and to defeat this entity that was just preying off of their country and their people. And so it was an honor to serve with them.
So how long were you there then?
So in a 2006, SF was doing shorter tours. So I was there for 6 months in 2006 and then 9 months in 2008. So those were my two tours.
And I don't know. I mean, we don't have to go exhaustively, but I know there was another election in the United States at that time, and I don't know how the politics of Washington play when you're on the ground in these places.
They do play.
They do play.
They do play. I mean, without trying to be political, I was in Iraq in 2008 when we had the presidential year election, and I was frustrated with the results simply because I felt like it wasn't that I didn't understand the people that were against the war. There was actually a lot of very valid reasons to I think be against the war, at least in the way that we were conducting it. But it had gotten to the point, even under the Bush administration, where for a team of highly trained Special Forces Green Berets to get outside the wire and do our job was a 42 PowerPoint slide presentation. So it was just, it had become so bureaucratic just to do our job. And there were a lot of us that said, I love being in SF. I don't mind being over here. This is what I want to do. If I'm going to be in the military and we're at war, I want to be deployed because that's my job. Mm-hmm. And you can ask me to be away from my family. My family understands that. My wife is incredible and always kept the home fires burning. You can ask me to be away. You can ask me to go into dangerous situations. What you don't get to do is ask me to do all that and then not let me do my job. And a lot of us started to feel that under the weight of just politics, that was what was happening. I was convinced that it was only going to get worse. Talking to many of the people that stayed in after I left, mm-hmm. they would confirm that it got worse. And I get it. There's political considerations. We have and should have civilian control of our military. But one of the things, I remember writing something in 2008 that I sent home. I said, the next time we go to war, I just hope the American people turn off their televisions and don't pay any attention. I would rather have, and I said this in a moment of frustration, I said I'd rather have their apathy than their support, because I felt like the support was very fleeting. Whereas if there was apathy, then we could just go do our job to the best of our ability. I will say that, and I'll never forget having a conversation with a friend of mine who was another Green Beret, and I said, Nate, I'm done. I'm done. I'm not doing one more deployment for people that just don't care. Mm-hmm. Or the people that just, that they want to have an opinion about something that they haven't even taken, 10 minutes to really understand. And I look back at that and I feel bad about having that sentiment, because that wasn't the case.
But that was real at the time. So that was certainly my perspective. But then again, I might not have been doing my own due diligence, because one thing that I really am grateful for, especially to our Vietnam veterans, every time we came home, there was, I still get choked up about that. Every time we came home, there were Vietnam vets in the airport. Mm-hmm. Making sure that what happened to them didn't happen to us. Yeah, and I know for a lot of them, they didn't have that.
No.
Yeah, my husband was Vietnam, and he's, quite frankly, still bitter about that, because they got they really didn't get, it was either very poor or no reception or hostile. So.
Well, and I'll tell you, please thank him for that. And every time I meet a Vietnam veteran, the first thing I always say to him is like, you need to understand, my generation of soldiers, you're our heroes. You're the reason why we joined. We're proud of you. Because it was, especially if you look at the Vietnam era, the Vietnam veterans spent more consistent days in combat than any soldiers in U.S. history. And it was the most thankless war we've ever served in. But the way that they conducted themselves, it really did lay the groundwork, especially for someone that served in Special Forces, where Vietnam was really the first. We draw our lineage back to OSS during World War II, but Vietnam really was the first test of Army Special Forces. And every time I meet a Vietnam veteran, I'm like, I not only thank you for what you did in Vietnam and thank you for the example that you set, but I also thank you for what you did for us when we were engaged in what became an unpopular war as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So now you're there for second deployment in 2008, mm-hmm. and how long were you there that time?
That was 9 months.
9 months, that's right, you said that.
Yeah, my third daughter had been born 4 months earlier.
I was going to ask you, because these children are, you have three, so.
Our kids started to work on the deployment cycle. And that's the other component of this, that the entire service felt it, regardless of what branch you were in and whatnot. The deployment schedule became really tough, and I think it was easier for me than it was for a lot of people. But in Special Forces, we would go to a combat deployment, and then when we came home, it didn't mean you were at home. It meant you had training deployments you would go on, or you would have. We were still doing what at that time they called JSETs, which is Joint Combined Exercise Training, because in 1st Special Forces Group we were responsible for Asia. So we would go and train Korean military or Bangladeshi military, Filipino military. So when we'd come home from a combat deployment, we'd get some time with family, do some training, and then go for another 5 or 6 week deployment. come back, maybe go through another 5-week school. And so it was very tough on the families. And I had 3 children before I got out of the service, but that's the part where Tina was just incredible. And it's the reason why I have, especially at that time, I think I had a very good relationship with all 3 of my kids, Lily, Luke, and Allie, was because when I was gone, Tina was just adamant. She would make little shirts for them with a picture of Daddy on it, and she would, tell them stories because they're young at this point.
Sure.
I mean, me being gone, it would be easy to forget. Luke looked at me a little skeptical when I came home, like, "Who's this guy? You realize this is my bed, right?" Yeah. So, this is my mommy. I don't know what you're doing here, but yeah, she did that, and it was amazing because Tina wrote an article once because she noticed the difference on how people would thank her. So when people would find out that she was married to a service member who was deployed, some people would come over and say, "I just really thank you for your service, and I just can't tell you how much we're praying for them, and if you never need anything, please let us know." She was very grateful for that. You would have other people that would come up and say, "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry for you. I'm so sorry that he's gone. I wish they would just bring them all home." And we just... Tina finally once got tired of it. She goes, "I don't need your pity." She goes, "You need to understand, my husband's not the only one serving. We're all serving. This is family service to our country. And regardless of the politics involved, we're proud of both his service and ours. And we're doing a job back here at home as well." And it's just, again, beaming with pride.
There you go.
And she was just exemplary in that. And you look at the spouse networks and whatnot that they had, and because they did that. None of those, none of the people, both husbands and wives, none of them signed up to be single parents. But that was the role they had to fill a lot of the time, and Tina just did a fantastic job.
Oh, that's okay. So now you get out in what, 2000? You moved to Culpeper in like around 2010. So
I got out in June of '09.
Okay.
And so I had visited Culpeper kind of off and on, both when I was a student
Sure.
and then in the military. And so we moved to Woodbridge first because the place I was working was actually up in Tyson's Corner, and started looking for property in Culpeper. So there were a lot of weekends where we would actually drive out to Culpeper, drive around looking for properties, and then drive back. And we always felt excited as we got to Culpeper and a little bit depressed as we were driving back to Woodbridge. And there was a property that came up for sale. And before it even hit the market or Zillow or realestate.com, our real estate agent found it, and it was little 10 acres up in just north of town in the county, and it's perfect. I love that our kids can go outside and run around and build forts, and I love that we don't have cable, except for missing this show, of course. I watch it online, so it's okay. But yeah, and just the community in general. And another thing that was really nice is we realized that there's very deep roots in this community. There's people that have farmed here for 300 years,
yes.
and the land we live on is actually Apperson land, which they have a family cemetery on our neighbor's property going back all the way to the 1700s, and so that kind of connection to the history of the country is, I'm always overwhelmed by it, and I love that my kids grow up in an environment where they can experience that. And
so in terms of your military service, then you were in for what, 10, 11 years?
11 years active
Now,
duty.
have you stayed in reserves, or you're out now?
I did. So I did a little less than a year in the National Guard my senior year of high school, and then I did another year in the National Guard the year after I got out. But between work and then serving in the legislature, and there's a couple of times I toyed around with the idea of going back to the National Guard, and Tina looks at me and she's like, "Yeah, one more thing on your plate. That would be a great idea." So that's her subtle indicator that would probably not be
I think it's
appreciated.
interesting because I know that for a while you served as chairman of the Republican committee here. So you got out of military, but you've kept very involved, and of course now you're serving as delegate for the 30th district. So you're definitely kept involved.
Oh, it's kept me big. Well, and when I was getting out, because most people don't get out after 11 years. They usually go the full 20. And I had a sergeant major who I really respected come up to me and, "Nick, why are you getting out?" I said, "Sergeant Major, look how hard it was for us to do our jobs over there. I mean, you want me to spend at that point, if I would have done another 9 more years, I probably would have spent 6 of them away from home, at least. I said, you know, I would do that if I thought we were really going to be allowed to get out there and do what we're supposed to do. And he goes, Nick, that's not a good excuse. You stay in, you get rank, and you fix the problem. And I looked back at him and I said, you're a sergeant major. How many problems have you been able to fix? And because I could get a little lippy at times.
Okay.
And the sergeant major looked back at me, and it was kind of one of those
aha moments.
That's a good point, Nick. And he goes, so what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to get involved in policy. I said, I think the majority of our problems don't rest with our military leadership, although there are some. I think it rests with our political leadership. And I think some of the problems within our military leadership are a result of our political leadership. So I didn't know if that meant running for office. Really what I thought it meant was that I would just probably finish my degree and do something within defense policy, hopefully advising political leaders and trying to give a ground perspective. And then when I got asked to run for office, I said no. And then I got asked again, and I considered it. And I think one of the things I really, there's definitely challenges, but one of the things I really love about it is that I do have a forum now to be able to advocate for both our active duty and our veterans. You know, the motto in Special Forces is quiet professionals. The guys in uniform don't, you know, they don't complain. They complain internally. They don't complain externally. And I kind of joke around with some of my friends. I say, well, I'm out now. I don't have to be quiet or professional. And we have been able to actually affect things. There was another Green Beret that was potentially going to be removed for the service, and we were able to advocate on his behalf, and the Army changed their decision. Certainly not just because of what we did, but I don't think it's boasting to say that I think we contributed. And so being able to make those kinds of decisions in a way that I think really do help both our active duty and our veterans that's again, I feel at least like I'm living up to my promise to that Sergeant Major that I may be leaving the service, but I'm not going to leave the guys.
You're not leaving the, yeah. Now, I know that you do some teaching with some homeschooled groups, but one of the things that I always find kind of interesting is if you had a group of young people in front of you, what would be your message in terms of military service or how you feel about that, looking toward future generations?
Sure. You know, I certainly don't believe that everybody has to serve in the military, but I do think it's, especially for people that maybe if they're not quite sure what they want to do, or even if they are sure what they want to do, spending some time and serving in the military, I know for me was an outstanding experience. There will be nothing in my professional life that I ever do that will ever compare with that. In my professional life, that'll always be the thing I'm most proud of, was serving with a Special Forces team in Iraq. The camaraderie that you built there, the ethics of serving in the military, and I think the other component, and this was something I was able to speak on Veterans Day. In the military, I really do believe that there's a unity of purpose there. A lot of diversity in what people think, what they believe, where they come from, and you'll be on a team, and it'll be someone from, you know, a rural county with 200 people, and someone from, you know, downtown Brooklyn, and so the perspective that you get. And that sort of exposure to different ideas and different ways that people grew up from across the country is incredible in and of itself. The perspective that you get going overseas. One of the benefits of the military is you can potentially see a lot of the world, and most of it's not on anybody's bucket list. You know, the cruise ships are not going to these places. So you get a very sincere appreciation for what we have here in this country, and you realize that it's not a foregone conclusion. I think for people that have never left the United States and never really been into places where it's either a war-torn area or just something where true abject poverty, you realize that this didn't happen by accident. And it took work to build, it takes work to preserve. And that new appreciation, I think, it allows you to get over some of the other barriers, the things that tend to divide us, because especially in a combat situation, when the rounds start flying, a lot of the other things that separate you or divide you become a lot more petty, and you really realize what matters. And at that point, and I don't buy into, there's a lot of people, it's become popular to say that servicemen and women, they're not fighting for the country or the Constitution, they're fighting for the person to their left and right. Okay, well, I didn't know the person to my left or right before I joined the military. I joined the military because I did want to fight for my country and because I did want to fight for my Constitution. And so that never stopped being a driving factor. They are right that once you do forge those friendships, yeah, there's a lot of things that you're willing to go through and endure in order to protect the person to your left and right. But it's all of those components together that I think makes up the military experience. The camaraderie, the emphasis on honor and responsibility, and the fact that you have a personal responsibility, you have a duty to fulfill that no one's going to do for you. There was definitely some situations, I'll never forget my dad telling me a story. He was actually sitting on an officer-involved shooting board where the commanders were looking at a police officer that had been involved in a very dangerous shooting. And one of the leaders wanted to just throw this guy into the bus, and everyone else thought he was just a hero. And my dad said, I was sitting in the elevator, and the one officer that wanted to throw this guy into the bus was confused by the decision that said, no, not only are we not going to throw him into the bus, we're going to be interested to see what medal you put him in for. And so he goes, the captain looks over to one of the review board members and says, you don't think, he reacted the wrong way in that situation? And the guy looks back and goes, well, no, what was he supposed to? We don't want people to start calling the fire department. This is our job. and I remembered that in certain moments in Iraq where it was, you're looking at it going, gosh, there's no easy way to do this, but we're the ones they call when there's no easy way to do this. And doing that and fulfilling your duty, and I always say we overuse the word hero a lot. We really do. I knew some people that were genuine heroes, and I always say like, I wasn't a hero. I am very content with the fact that I feel like I did my job, and that if the people I served with ever had to go back, they wouldn't be ashamed to have me there with them, and that's good enough for me. But that experience, I think it's important. You get a connection to not only our country in general, but really our institutions, which make the country great. Our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, the philosophy behind those things. The idea that regardless of where you came from, we are not as interested with who your parents were in this country. We're very interested with the content of your character. That all comes through in the military. And so yeah, I would encourage people, if they're at all interested in serving the military, it's probably a good idea.
And the Army.
Oh yeah, of course the Army.
Of course.
Yeah, again, there's other branches. Yeah.
There are. All right, very good. This has been really an honor today, Nick. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap this up?
I want to thank you guys for doing this. I do think it's something that
I think it's very important to share the stories.
Well, and the more generations of veterans we lose, and we were talking about this.
We're talking about that a little bit before the World War II.
The World War II and the Korea War veterans, we're losing many of them every day, and we're probably about 5 years away from not having many of them left. And so recording their stories and making sure that future generations understand the price that was paid in order to get to where we are today. And to realize that it's not something that we just want them to feel gratitude for, it's something we want them to feel pride in. This is a part of their legacy as well. So you doing this means a lot to me, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And to our viewers out there, again, this is part of a series that is airing on Culpeper Media Network, War Veterans, History of Our Heroes. If you know a veteran or you are a veteran and would like to be on the program, you can give me a call or John at Culpeper Media Network. We look forward to sharing more of these stories with you, and thank you for joining us today.